Shortly after midnight on April the 18th of 2023, a pair of cheerleaders was shot after one of them got into the wrong vehicle outside a supermarket in Texas. The team's practice had just ended when the two went to the H-E-B located at 1080 East Highway 290 in Elgin with two other members of the cheer squad. One of the victims, 21-year-old Heather Roth, accidentally opened the door to a car she thought was her friend's, but noticed a man she didn't know in the driver's seat. After quickly realizing her mistake, she returned to her friend's vehicle. The man followed her and approached the car. When Roth rolled the window down, he opened fire, then fled the scene. Roth was grazed by a bullet, but another cheerleader, 18-year-old Peyton Washington, was shot in the leg and back, which caused her to vomit blood. Roth was treated at the scene while Washington was airlifted to a hospital. The teen reportedly sustained a shattered spleen, 2 holes in her stomach and another 2 in her diaphragm. As a result of her critical injuries, she was placed in the intensive care unit. Her ruptured spleen was removed as well as part of her pancreas. During the course of the investigation, the supermarket manager was able to identify the suspect, 25-year-old Pedro Tello Rodriguez Jr., through surveillance video, which captured the man's license plate. Rodriguez was arrested later that morning before being booked at the Bastrop County Jail on a $500,000 bond. He was facing charges that included a count of third-degree felony deadly conduct and 3 counts of aggravated assault with a firearm. As per the Penal Code of the state of Texas, Rodriguez could serve up to 10 years in prison for his crimes. On June the 2nd of 2023, a judge heard that the suspect, who was an employee at the grocery store, had previously had his car broken into and robbed. Rodriguez's attorney said that the man had been startled by Roth's sudden appearance in his vehicle and thought he was going to be robbed again. Given the circumstances of the ordeal and Rodriguez's lack of a criminal record, his bail was reduced to $100,000. Number 7. Keelan Ahmad Pickens. An argument over college football ended in a deadly shooting on October the 9th of 2021. The incident took place at a home in Bessemer, a suburb of Birmingham, Alabama, while a group of friends watched a game between the Alabama Crimson Tide and the Texas A&M Aggies. The game was in its final minutes when 2 men were asked to leave the 6th Avenue residence because of an argument over which team was better. Shortly after 11 p.m., after the pair had gone outside to the parking lot, gunshots rang out. 27-year-old Keelan Ahmad Pickens was found suffering from several wounds to the torso. The young man responsible, 20-year-old Emmanuel Talbot III, fled the scene before law enforcement arrived. Pickens was taken to a hospital where he was pronounced dead early the next morning. Talbot reportedly turned himself into the police and was booked at the Jefferson County Jail on murder charges. His bond was set at $150,000. Number 6. Michael Farrow. Kansas police arrested Wichita man Glenn A. Farrow on suspicion of killing his own son in March of 2017. On the night of the 19th, the 41-year-old was in his front yard arguing with his son Michael. The dispute reportedly centered on the topic of when school would resume after spring break. As the argument escalated, Glenn pulled out a .38 caliber handgun and fired it at the fleeing teen at least 3 times. Responding officers later found Michael in an alley parking zone behind Glenn's house with a gunshot wound in his torso. The victim was taken to Wesley Medical Center where he died shortly after 9:30 p.m. The next morning, Glenn was taken into police custody and booked into the Sedgwick County Jail on a $150,000 bond. He was charged with second-degree murder but pleaded guilty to an amended count of voluntary manslaughter in April. 2 months later, Glenn was sentenced to more than 20 years in prison for the filicide, which under Kansas law was the maximum sentence. The judge called the shooting a cold, heartless, soulless, and cowardly act. In court, Glenn said that he didn't deserve forgiveness from his family. Number 5. Alicia Flores. On the night of December the 30th of 2021, Alicia Flores' lifeless body was found in a vehicle parked outside of Centerfolds nightclub in Chico, California. At around 9:40 p.m., the 21-year-old had arrived at the nightclub in a white SUV along with her friend and the friend's boyfriend, Fernando Palomares, aged 29. The latter allegedly went in and out of the establishment several times before all 3 left together shortly after 10:30 p.m. An hour later, Flores' friend went back inside the club and asked the staff to call 911 because the young woman had been shot. Palomares fled the scene while Flores succumbed to several gunshot wounds, including one to her head. Palomares was later spotted walking down Highway 99 and Rowles Road, 7 miles from the nightclub, at about 4:30 p.m. When speaking to officers, he claimed that he'd been home all night and was simply out for a walk. He was arrested and taken to the Butte County Jail, where he was booked on suspicion of violating parole. Law enforcement discovered that Palomares had previously been arrested in connection with a 2012 stabbing. Investigators from the Butte County Sheriff's Office found a 9mm semi-automatic handgun in Palomares' possession. According to the district attorney, ballistic testing results confirmed that it was the same weapon used in Flores' killing. On May the 20th of 2022, a judge ruled that there was sufficient evidence for Palomares to stand trial for the murder. As of the latest updates, the man remained in custody without bond. Number 4. Gabriela Gonzalez. Dallas police were called to a gas station parking lot in the 800 block of Walton Walker Boulevard on May the 10th of 2023. Dispatchers had received reports of a deadly shooting at the location in question, where officers found 26-year-old Gabriela Gonzalez dead from multiple gunshot wounds. During the investigation that followed, police learned that Gonzalez had just returned from Colorado, where she had an abortion the day before she died. The woman's ex-boyfriend, 22-year-old Harold Levance Thompson, was identified as the likely father of the unborn child. Investigators learned that Thompson had been charged with assault 2 months earlier, and that he and Gonzalez had recently ended a reportedly tumultuous 4-month involvement. An affidavit indicated that the young man had been violent throughout the entirety of the relationship. Further investigation uncovered shocking surveillance footage which showed Gonzalez and Thompson arguing in the parking lot leading up to the shooting. Gonzalez was subsequently choked by her ex, but she pushed him away. He then pulled out a firearm and gunned her down. Gonzalez's sister, who happened to be passing by the area, heard the sound of gunfire and turned to see her sister on the ground. Thompson fired several additional rounds into the incapacitated woman before fleeing the scene. The man was later arrested and booked at the Dallas County Jail without bond, charged with first-degree murder. Number 3. Whitehall City Kroger. An Ohio woman was shot in the leg outside a Kroger grocery store in Whitehall City shortly after 3 p.m. on October the 10th of 2022. The Whitehall Division of Police revealed that the shooting unfolded in the store's parking lot, located at 3675 East Broad Street. Law enforcement were called to the scene, but when they arrived, the victim and suspect had already left. They caught up with the female victim at Mount Carmel East Hospital with non-life-threatening injuries. She had reportedly known the suspect, Stephanie Robinson, prior to the incident. They'd been arguing before Robinson pulled out a gun and fired. At approximately 7:30 p.m., the 36-year-old suspect was arrested after the Whitehall SWAT team executed a search warrant at an apartment in Columbus. Robinson was charged with felonious assault and held in custody on a $125,000 bond. Today's topic was requested by All Gemini 05, Vicky Hottie and Reno, and Neon Paints 48. If you have any other topics you'd like to learn about, subscribe and let us know in the comments section below. Number 2. Detroit parking lot. The police in Detroit, Michigan sought the general public's assistance in identifying a woman who callously fired half a dozen shots at another woman on November the 10th of 2021. The incident occurred in the parking lot of a liquor store in the 9000 block of Hay Street. According to investigators, the 25-year-old victim was leaving the lot in a Kia Rio when gunfire rang out shortly before 11:30 p.m. The female suspect and several other people she was with at the time subsequently fled the scene in a black Mercury Mountaineer. Bullets struck the victim's car, but no injuries were reported, and the motive for the shooting was unclear. As of the latest updates, authorities were still seeking the suspect, who was wanted for aggravated assault. In case you were longing for a bigger They Will Kill You dosage still, then we have our previous release on when truckers go wrong, lined up for you right after number 1. Number 1. Anthony Ames. A heated confrontation in the parking lot outside an Arizona 7-Eleven culminated with 79-year-old Anthony Ames being fatally hit by a car shortly before 4:30 p.m. on March the 24th of 2022. Ames and his friend, Joy Roman, got into an argument with Elaine Vernette Boone outside the convenience store located near the 1000 block of North Columbus Boulevard in Tucson. 20-year-old Boone subsequently drove her car directly at the pair of friends and ran them over before leaving the scene on foot. Roman later said she saw the vehicle's tire barreling towards her face in the moments before she blacked out. The collision caused both Ames and Roman to suffer life-threatening injuries, and they were taken to Banner University Medical Center. Roman sustained several broken bones, including her pelvis, ribs, and face, while Ames succumbed to extensive injuries 9 days later. Boone was identified as the individual responsible and was arrested near East Pima Street on April the 5th. She was booked at the Pima County Jail with her bail set at just over $500,000. The young woman was facing several charges, including second-degree homicide. Boone was ultimately found guilty of neglect homicide and sentenced to 30 months of incarceration to be served at the Arizona State Prison Complex, Perryville. Number 7. The Gardener Expressway collision. On March the 23rd of 2021, a Toronto nurse was involved in a harrowing collision with a dump truck on the Gardener Expressway. At the time of the incident, 26-year-old Courtney Earhart was driving her Mini Cooper to work, where she'd been helping vaccinate homeless people in the area. At about 10 a.m., she was rear-ended by a dump truck as she was merging onto the westbound ramp near the intersection of Lakeshore Boulevard and Jarvis Street. Her vehicle was flipped sideways as the truck proceeded to push her up the ramp. The trucker was seemingly oblivious to the fact that Earhart's Mini Cooper had become lodged beneath his bumper, and he continued pushing her for more than 2,000 feet, which is a distance greater than that of 5 football fields. A couple who'd witnessed the entire ordeal was able to pull in front of the dump truck and finally get the driver to stop. Earhart was examined by paramedics who'd been called to the scene. While she was sore and shocked, the nurse fortunately came away without any serious injuries, and she consequently didn't have to go to the hospital. The driver of the truck was reportedly shaken upon realizing what had transpired, and he was charged with several traffic-related offenses. Number 6. Rogel Lazaro Aguilera Maderos. A 25-year-old truck driver faced criminal charges after he lost control of his vehicle and caused a fiery crash along a Colorado mountain highway on April the 15th of 2019. The Texas-based trucker was identified as Rogel Lazaro Aguilera Maderos, who was hauling lumber in his semi-trailer when the devastating accident occurred. It was reported that the brakes to Aguilera Maderos' truck were failing at the time of the incident, causing him to travel down Interstate 70 at speeds of up to 85 miles per hour. He allegedly passed a total of 4 runaway truck ramps along the roadway, instead attempting to weave dangerously in and out of traffic. At one point, the trucker was driving along the shoulder and aimed to clip the back of a parked semi. In order to reduce his vehicle's momentum, Aguilera Maderos' last-ditch efforts were unsuccessful, and he ultimately plowed into stopped traffic, triggering a 28-car pileup that took the lives of 4 individuals. During his trial, Aguilera Maderos admitted that he'd never driven along the Colorado mountains before and was unfamiliar with the interstate. In October of 2021, he was convicted on 27 counts, 4 of which were vehicular homicide. Number 5. Wayne Adam Ford. A trucker from Petaluma, California, confessed to carrying out a series of violent murders between 1997 and 1998. Wayne Adam Ford began working as a long-haul trucker after he'd gotten divorced from his wife and moved to the Northern California coast. The first dead body that was linked to Ford was found in October of 1997. Authorities believed the female victim had been a hitchhiker picked up by the truck driver prior to her death. Identification was made impossible by the extreme dismemberment of her corpse. Ford had taken her various body parts to different locations, and he allegedly attempted to cook some of them after storing them in his freezer. The trucker's next victims were a pair of escorts, identified as 26-year-old Tina Renee Gibbs and Lynette Dayon White, aged 25, whose nude bodies were discovered in June and October of 1998, respectively. Ford's final victim was Patricia Ann Tamez, whose body was found floating in the California Aqueduct in San Bernardino County. Roughly a week later, Ford turned himself into the Humboldt County Sheriff's Department. He walked into the office with Tamez's severed breast in his pocket. Ford ultimately confessed to the 4 murders, but investigators have theorized that the trucker may have been responsible for other killings as well. He was charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death in August of 2006. Number 4. Timothy J. Verifides. In November of 2016, a Utah trucker was found guilty of enslaving women in his semi-trailer as he drove across the United States. Timothy J. Verifides was first brought into custody in 2014 after police officers at a Minnesota way station noticed bruises on the face of a 19-year-old woman who was traveling with the truck driver. Upon further investigation, it emerged that the young woman had previously filed a restraining order against Verifides that prohibited him from contacting her. Verifides had attacked her when she'd attempted to leave him, inflicting the bruises that ultimately caught the attention of law enforcement officials. Following the trucker's arrest, a second woman came forward and reported that she'd been held captive in Verifides' truck in a similar manner as the first victim when she was 18 years of age. In the ensuing court proceedings, it was established that Verifides had abused a total of 6 women. He faced charges in connection to only 2 of them, however, as the other cases were reportedly too old for legal action to be taken. Verifides was allegedly obsessed with vampires and he branded his truck the Twilight Express. It was revealed in court that the driver regularly assaulted his victims after trapping them in his semi-trailer and forcibly grinding down their teeth. Verifides, who was dubbed the vampire trucker by certain media outlets, pleaded guilty to the charges levied against him and he was subsequently sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. Number 3. Bruce Mendenhall. A long-haul truck driver from Albion, Illinois, was found to have been responsible for a string of serial killings at various truck stops across the U.S. On July the 12th of 2007, Bruce Mendenhall was remanded into custody at the TA truck stop off Interstate 24 in Nashville, Tennessee, while investigating the murder of Sarah Nicole Hulbert, which had taken place at the same stop just a few weeks prior. A local detective identified Mendenhall's truck as the same one that had been spotted on surveillance cameras on the night of the young woman's death. Upon inspecting Mendenhall's vehicle, law enforcement officials discovered the presence of bloody clothing in a plastic sack and also found splotches of blood all over the cab, including on the steering wheel. After his arrest, Mendenhall implicated himself in at least 2 additional murders while being interviewed by investigators. The targets of his violent attacks were primarily young female escorts. Although he was ultimately charged with the murders of 4 women whom he'd picked up at truck stops in Alabama, Tennessee, and Indiana, he was still under investigation for murders in 5 other states at the time of his incarceration. While serving out the multiple life sentences he'd been given, Mendenhall was sentenced to an additional 30 years behind bars after it was discovered that he tried to arrange the murders of 3 witnesses from his trial. Number 2. Jordan Alexander Barson. A 45-year-old truck driver was sentenced to a prison term of 16 years after he was convicted on a charge of causing death while driving under the influence of methamphetamine. On December the 10th of 2020, the box truck operated by Jordan Alexander Barson of Kingman, Arizona, struck a safety escort vehicle that was following behind a group of about 20 bicyclists riding on a stretch of US Highway 95, south of Boulder City, Nevada. The escort then plowed into the vulnerable cyclists, claiming the lives of 5 and seriously injuring 2 others. One of the wounded victims was airlifted to a nearby hospital, while the other was transported via an ambulance in critical condition. A 3rd bicyclist also suffered minor wounds. It was reported that Barson had remained at the scene after the fatal collision until the arrival of Nevada Highway Patrol officials, who examined the brakes, tires, and overall functionality of his vehicle. The commercial truck driver told investigators that he'd fallen asleep at the wheel while driving his normal work route. According to court records, Barson's blood was tested revealing that the man's body contained 9 times the amount of methamphetamine necessary to indicate impairment. Barson ultimately agreed to a plea deal with prosecutors which avoided trial on 14 felony charges that could have resulted in a life sentence. In addition to the 16 years Barson was ultimately sentenced to serve, the Clark County District Court judge that presided over the trucker's case ordered the defendant to pay nearly $60,000 in restitution to the victims of the crash. Number 1. Clark Perry Baldwin. A former long-haul trucker was taken into police custody in May of 2020 after it was discovered that he'd perpetrated the murders of 3 women during the early 1990s. Clark Perry Baldwin, who was in his late 50s at the time of his arrest, had worked as a truck driver from the second half of the 1980s until the mid-1990s. His first alleged victim was a 32-year-old pregnant woman by the name of Pamela Rose McCall, who'd last been seen climbing into a tractor-trailer at a truck stop in Tennessee. Her body was eventually found a few miles from the stop in March of 1991, and it was determined that she'd been strangled to death. The following year, Baldwin carried out 2 more slayings in Wyoming. The strangled, unclothed body of a young woman was found by a female truck driver near Interstate 80. The unidentified victim was referred to as Bitter Creek Betty. A month later, the remains of a pregnant woman were discovered off of Interstate 90, which led to the victim being dubbed I-90 Jane Doe. While each of the murder cases had gone cold for nearly 3 decades, investigators were able to finally identify Baldwin as the killer through the use of genetic genealogy. DNA that had been uploaded to a genealogy site by one of the suspect's relatives was used to link the former trucker to evidence found at the original crime scenes. Baldwin was subsequently arrested at his home in Waterloo, Iowa. He faced multiple counts of first-degree murder in connection to his violent crimes. The ex-truck driver had been arrested about a month prior to the murder of McCall after he'd been accused of strangling a woman in a truck in Texas. But all charges in that case were dismissed because the victim had failed to show up to court. Thanks for watching. Would you rather have to park your car 2 miles from your house or give up driving altogether? Let us know in the comments section below.